Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Moira Buffini's A Vampire Play. So this is a young adults play. It's complex and it's interesting. One of the main things that's complex or challenging about this play is that we have a high degree of uncertainty in the play, and we'll talk more about what that means. It's also a very meta-theatrical play. This draws a lot on the theater theories of Bertolt Brecht, which is one of the overt references in the play. But this idea of making it difficult for the audience to accept illusion, the illusion of the theater. Basically, there's we can't watch a vampire play and sort of convince ourselves, all right, what I'm seeing is real. It's not verisimilitude. It is clearly something that is staged and constructed as a staged play, and that's very, very Brechtian. Because it's meant to prompt the audience to think about their own situation, political, social, economic, cultural, whatever it is. So we start with two sets of characters. I'll say sets of characters. One is Eleanor, so just a single character. It says here, Eleanor is 16. She is dressed in a costume of 1822. She is on stage almost all the time. There's a small writing desk where she occasionally sits and writes, although her focus should always be on the action. And her opening lines are, "People will always believe the most fabulous tale you can tell. It's the one that they secretly long for. It must be unprovable, impossible, fantastical. To believe it then becomes an act of faith. An act of faith." Scene 1, a train. So right from the beginning, this is Brechtian. We have a narrator figure. She's not technically a narrator, but she sets up the play, and she gives us one of these initial central ideas, which is about belief in the unbelievable. Then we're introduced to Ella and Claire. Ella is a kind of modernized version of Eleanor, and Claire is a modernized version of Clara, who is Eleanor's mother in the early 19th century scenes. So we've got that temporal gap, and that's a very postmodern thing. It's a very Brechtian thing to a certain extent. We don't yet know those relationships yet. They sort of develop over the course of the play. So basically what we learn is that Ella and Claire have left their previous town that they were living in under less than favorable circumstances, and they're now coming to a new town to try and make a new life for themselves. Ella is apparently very intelligent. She's had a lot of schooling at different schools. She's got a lot of education, etc., etc. And Claire is trying to convince her to enroll in a school and take particular programs, whatever it is. Scene 2 takes us to her drama class. Basically, the people in this, most of the students in the drama class are terrible. The teacher is pretty much a dick to them, and they in turn are dicks to him. But Ella, who is now going by the name Eleanor Withenshaw, she is not the only new student. The other new student is Frank Adam Stein. So we've immediately got a reference there. Frankenstein obviously is the reference, Frank Stein. but also in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, Frankenstein's creation is called a new Adam or a modern Adam or whatever it is. So we've got these clear associations. And as Frank sort of introduces himself, they play a hot seat game, basically, where the instructor and the students can ask Frank questions and he has to answer them. We learn that he has been homeschooled his entire life. His parents are sort of overprotective. And he says, Frank explains, perhaps they were worried that I might grow up normal if I went to school, so they decided to concentrate all their efforts on turning me into a freak. Point, who's another student in the class, asks why. And Frank says, well, they're freaks, so I expect they just wanted me to fit in. Apparently they're like super you must know things. Like Frank has a genius level IQ, and they basically like taught him. Like at one point they say he could read at a 12th grade reading level when he was in 6th grade or something like this. So, it's this kind of thing. When it comes to Ella's turn to answer questions, the instructor, Mint, decides they're going to do something different. She's going to tell them something about her childhood, and then the class is going to act it out. She starts telling them about her childhood in an orphanage in 1812. And Mint is initially not sort of on board with this because he assumes that it's fiction. Ella insists that it isn't, that it is her actual childhood memories. And finally, Mint sort of just accepts it for the purposes of doing a dramatic exercise. And Moon, who's another student in the class, says, listen, if this was 1812, how come you've not decomposed? And Ella says, I freely confess that I have stayed alive for all these years by drinking human blood. So basically, she tells them that she is a vampire. And predictably, none of them really believe her. Mint actually suggests that this may be a fantasy or a delusion based on some kind of trauma, something like this. So clearly we've got this tension, and this is one of the things that I think is really, really good about this play. We've got this tension between Ella's insistence that she's a vampire and her ability to describe in detail the conditions of the impoverished underworld of London in 1812 and into the 1820s, versus everyone's sort of casual assumption that this is some sort of elaborate fantasy or delusion. Frank becomes very, very interested in Ella, but he's super awkward. So, that happens. And he starts sort of asking her different questions about being a vampire and like, how come you can walk in daylight? I ate some garlic before. Why aren't you withering or whatever it is that you do? And basically Eleanor's like, yeah, most vampire lore is bullshit. Like, sunlight is not an issue, garlic is fine, etc., etc. The story becomes more elaborate. Ella's story becomes more elaborate when in scene 5, she does a homework assignment for the drama class in which the prompt is to write a short scene incorporating some of Brecht's techniques of alienation. Subject matter, a secret. Basically, she writes this lengthy, like, Mint later calls it most of a complete play. She writes this lengthy play that as we see her on stage writing it is also being acted out on stage. So we've got that sort of that component of generating the action through the act of writing. Ella conceptualizes this as presenting a memory, but it's not 100% clear. The very fact that it's being presented as fiction, as a Brechtian-inspired short play, raises questions about whether or not we should trust this account. But basically, it is the story of how her mother became a vampire and then turned her into a vampire in the early 1800s. Her mother, Clara, who later takes on the role of her sister, Claire. Clara was a prostitute who was dying of tuberculosis, and so she sort of finagles her way to Turkey, to what's now Istanbul. And there's a running joke, because the first guy refers to it as Byzantium, and somebody else says Constantinople, surely. And then the second person refers to it as Constantinople, and the third person says Istanbul, surely. That's a good joke. It's funnier in the context than when I just presented it, but that's how it goes. So I mean, there's that element of it. It's a fully developed story, and basically the idea is this is Ella's sort of revelation. This is her decision to tell the truth about her identity as a vampire, but because she chooses a medium of fiction, it's hard to tell how much we should trust it. And in fact, she does. Frank at some point wants to meet Claire, her sister, and Ella basically says no. And the reason she gives is because she'll tell you lies. Claire will try and tell you that I'm only 16. She'll try to tell you that our mother died 3 years ago of cancer. She'll try to tell you that they couldn't trace our useless sperm of a father, so they put me in a care home. Claire will tell you I got raped there. She came and found me all withdrawn and suicidal. She'll tell you how she fought for me, rescued me, breathed her life force into me. Since then, she's been my mother. She'll tell you that we go from town to town avoiding social workers and police, and that she sticks at low-paid jobs because they give her the opportunity to steal. She'll tell you how her magpie heart is satisfied by simple little pleasures. She'll say she lives each moment to the full, and so she does. My sister-mother is ruthless, Frank, and so am I. So, again, we've got this sort of complex acknowledgement that there are competing versions of a truth. That it's not necessarily clear that we should believe or doubt Ella's story. And this is particular, we get, and there is, if this were just a question of Ella insists that she's a vampire and we have nothing else to go on, yeah, we would be very justified in dismissing that. But we know that at least two of the people that Claire interacts with, one of them we know disappears. One of Ella's classmates disappears after interacting very closely with Claire. And then Mint, the drama instructor, is found dead in the costume closet the morning after Claire had gone to see him. So that raises questions. We get further questions later in the play when in the food sciences class, culinary science, food technology is what it's called. A-level food technology, when the instructor is trying to teach them to make blood pudding, and Ella goes up to the front of the room and drinks the bowl of blood, much to everyone's horror, at which point they predictably lock her in a room and call psych services to have her evaluated, etc., etc. And actually, the play ends with Ella apparently in a psychiatric facility, finishing writing her story. But the story that she's finishing writing seems not to be the story from the play of how she became a vampire, but the story of her meeting Frank. So we have another interesting reversal. So the fact that she gets put in a psych ward at the end of the play, that always raises questions about the reliability of any character's testimony. So we've got that element. We've also got the reversal of the story that she's telling, going from telling her story to telling a version of the story that we've just seen in a vampire play. So that raises additional questions. And the last bit I want to talk about, because of Ella's vampirism, delusions of vampirism, fantasy, whatever it is, Frank apparently takes a lot of interest in watching vampire films. And we have this interesting little bit here with just this very, very small amount of cultural criticism or film and television studies criticism about vampire films. So he says, I've been watching a lot of vampire films. Ella says, what for? And Frank says, oh, thought I'd try and get to know you better. They say some great stuff. I mean, once you get past the cape era, you start wondering what they're a metaphor for. It might be AIDS, heroin, anorexia. It might be the whole spiraling chaos of Western society, not knowing the difference between good and evil anymore. I mean, not even being able to define the terms. And they're sexy and heartbroken and mostly Californian, and they keep coming out with fantastic cliches like, it's easier to succumb to the darkness within you than to fight the darkness without. And you get the feeling that if it wasn't for their nihilistic disregard for human life, they'd be the nearest thing we've got these days to gods. Ella says, could you say that again? Frank says, they used to be there just to terrify, as if the forces they represented had to be crushed by the righteous. But we don't want to crush them now. They fascinate us. Perhaps we're all becoming vampires. I mean, the way we devour everything. So, very, very short, but a really interesting piece of cultural commentary about the whole scope of vampire media. And this play was first performed in 2008. I don't know when the first bits of the Twilight series came out, but I think it was around that time, early 2000s, mid-2000s, mid-aughts, maybe, that the whole, everybody's fascinated with vampires thing really exploded. So having that commentary is a really interesting bit for that cultural moment.